Welcome to Exiger's live stream on how data analytics can transform complex investigations. I'm Dan Adamson, VDIQ President and Global Head of Cognitive Computing for Exiger, and I'll be your moderator today. I would like to remind everyone in our audience and in the live stream that the views expressed by our panelists are their own and not reflective of their companies. I'll start with making some introductions, and rather than spend the full hour on bios to do everyone's justice, I'll be very brief, and apologies for the brevity, but I do want to make sure we save time to get to the proper content. So on the far side of myself, on your left, we have Wayne Mattis. Thank you very much, Wayne, for joining us here today. Wayne is the Managing Director of Group Investigations at UBS. He manages a global investigations team consisting of lawyers, SMEs, and technologists that really transcends legal and compliance functions. Wayne's function covers all of the bank's business areas. Prior to UBS, he was the global leader at Pillsbury Winthrop's information law and electronic discovery practice, and a trial lawyer with over 30 years of experience. His team has been known in the industry to deliver exceptionally significant cost savings to his organization through the use of technology and investigations. So I would like to thank you, Wayne, for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
Next, we have Alex Southwell. He's a partner at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher's New York practice. Welcome, Alex. He is a specialist in white-collar criminal and regulatory enforcement defense, internal investigations, compliance monitoring, complex litigations, and he has led a number of high-profile internal investigations. He is also leading the firm's practice on cybersecurity. So welcome very much, Alex.
Thank you.
Next, we have Brandon Daniels. He is Managing Director and President of Exiger Analytics. Brandon brings over 15 years of investigations experience, leading and being involved in and managing the processes for many of the well-known publicized investigations consisting of a huge range across a huge range of domains, from LIBOR to foreign exchange to RMBS to ISDA fixed industry probes. Brandon has also investigations in the life sciences area, hundreds of investigations in FCPA, and emerging markets, AKS controls and clinical studies, KOP programs, and off-label marketing and pharmaceutical products. Welcome, Brandon. Richard Plansky is Managing Director and Global Head of Investigations for Exiger. Rich has led numerous complex investigations around intellectual property, infringement, fraud and embezzlement, employee misconduct, bribery, and some groundbreaking investigations as well in new areas such as trafficking of illegal firearms and media buying. He began his career as a prosecutor in the Manhattan's DA's office and also served as a senior criminal justice attorney for the Bloomberg administration. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Dan.
So today's agenda, we'd like to start off covering some brief questions, really rapid fire, just to give an overview of where the industry is currently around technology and integrating them into complex investigations. We're then going to try to do a deeper dive and follow up more deeply on some of the points, and hopefully we'll have time for some Q&A. So to begin, I will set the stage here and start with a brief definition of data analytics. Broadly speaking, it involves data and it involves analytics, you guessed it. But usually it involves vast amounts of data. Usually it's disparate data sources, and usually it's making sense of the data, which is the critical component to the analytics piece. It either involves generally detecting patterns or detecting anomalies that can be surfaced. So if we take that as a general definition, and I know there are lots of different definitions out there, but if we start with that, how is data analytics, maybe this is a question for you, Brandon, to kick it off, how is that implied specifically in investigations?
Sure. I would quote my friend Wayne Mattis and say that data analytics is turning information into meaning. And I'll give you just one very simple example. If you have a spreadsheet, let's say, of the sales figures for a pharmaceutical product over the last, let's say, 5 years, and that spreadsheet as a standalone document or a standalone piece of information tells you one very limited thing. But let's say in the scope of an off-label marketing investigation, you need to determine whether or not there might be an issue of off-label marketing in a pharmaceutical product sale. What you might do is you might pull some information from an industry survey, let's say, that shows the volume of indicative on-label uses for that product. And you might see that, for instance, there's only 500,000 people with the on-label condition for that product. But you might have 1 million instances of that product being prescribed. So bringing that spreadsheet together with some of these data sets that might be in the public domain, and then adding the meaning that's important to your investigation is, in my view, an example of data analytics. And it's an example of turning information into something meaningful and salient to your case.
And I think, Brandon, what you're alluding to there is something that maybe makes either a manual process not feasible traditionally into something that is achievable. But when I look at the state of the industry today, when I look at, for example, the New York Times deal books, I see huge growing costs to these investigations, especially the global complex ones. They often exceed over $100 million in cost. So, is there something wrong with the way complex investigations are done today? And maybe this is a question for you, Rich.
Sure. So to begin with, they take too long, they're too expensive, and they're overly reliant on armies of people. Apart from that, they're great. Now, there really exercises an inefficiency in my experience, and it's taken us a long time to get to this point. It wasn't that long ago, maybe 15 years ago, that the primary challenge in investigations, and I know that Alex will remember this from being a prosecutor, it was how do you find out good information about a person or an event? And the way that we used to meet that challenge was with skilled people. We would do interviews and review documents and knock on doors. And that worked pretty well. But then you fast forward to today, and if you think about investigations as exercises in reconstructing human behavior, especially in the workplace, has changed. So much of human behavior right now happens on computers and on mobile devices and on Bloomberg terminals and in proprietary trading systems, you name it. And it goes on 24/7, and it's all recorded. So there is a proliferation of data in terms of volume and variety, the likes of which we've never seen before. And the problem is that many companies are trying to meet that challenge by using the old tools, by throwing bodies at the problem. And this mismatch between problem and solution is causing dramatic inefficiencies.
Well, that's a great point, and I think, Wayne, you're known in the industry for someone who has really contributed to advancing the industry in its adoption of technology. Is there anything that you would like to add into our sort of overview of what technology, what gets incorporated, how is it being incorporated today, and any sort of overview remarks from you around data analytics in your investigations?
With the proliferation of data, there's been an increase in cost. It takes an additional amount of time. It's just too expensive.
But I think we need to also take a look at the fact that there also is an advantage of using better analytics. You get better results. If you take a look at human review and you analyze it, you see that people are really not very good at understanding documents. And if you give two really bright people a pile of the exact same documents and give them the same amount of information to assess what's relevant and what's not, they're going to come up with different answers. And studies have shown that they tend to correlate about 80% of the time, which is not very good. And if you take 3 people, you're lucky if the 3 of them correlate with relevant, not relevant, all 3 of them, about 50% of the time. So we can take it that human review, which some people consider the gold standard, is a fairly tarnished gold. If you add technology to this, if you are able to assess the likelihood of relevance of a particular document so that the person who reads it is more interested in it and will pay closer attention to it, if you give a more concentrated set of relevant or potentially relevant documents to an individual reviewer so that they can develop an understanding of the transaction and the individuals involved, the likelihood of their picking out what's significant and what's not and understanding it why is greatly enhanced. So I look at this problem differently perhaps than some people do. I completely agree with the fact that the increased amount of information is requiring us to do this. And I agree with the fact that speed is incredibly important in investigations, as we've talked about before.
Yeah.
But without doubt, getting a good result is critical as well, and I think that we get better results with it.
So if there's an explosion of data on the one hand, and it's coming from disparate sources, how, and maybe Brandon, this is a question for you, how do you access and assess these millions of documents? How do you introduce this concept of technology into your processes?
Absolutely. I think to start, it is a challenge that I think everyone that's starting an investigation really deals with and struggles with. Often it means us prioritizing certain data sets which are more readily accessible. Often it involves us using one data set to filter another. But I think the major challenge that you have is just the volume and frequency creates so much potential data and so much potential for evidence that's salient to your case that distilling down to the right evidence is even more sophisticated than it would have been had you had 100 attorneys in a room or 20 forensic accountants poring over reams of financial information. You have to put a much more creative mindset on when you're looking at the data and decide what data sets are going to compare with one another and give you good results. Are the decisions that you're making all one decision? Is everything just one type of relevance? Or going back to that spreadsheet I was talking about, are sales and clinical studies 2 types of relevance that I want to see where those 2 things meet at certain points in order to determine where there might be some kind of misconduct? I think when you're dealing with this volume of data, the sophistication of the investigator, the importance of the investigator is actually heightened. And I think the best way to utilize technology to manage this vast sum of data is to bring both that sophisticated investigator, that subject matter expert, that person that knows what potential misconduct looks like at a high level pattern perspective, and bring the technology together with that person. That's when you start to be able to tackle some of these more complex challenges.
Well, if I listen to Wayne say, humans are subjective by their very nature, and on the other hand, to utilize some of this technology requires a certain amount of creativity and understanding of the problem space, right? Alex, I think maybe this is a question for you. Given those 2 pieces here, how are regulators viewing the use of technology, and what are you seeing in terms of their both I think internally and externally seeing how this is being applied?
I mean, it's a really interesting dichotomy, actually, because I think regulators, on the one hand, are quite sophisticated in their use of data analytics, but the individual investigators that are sometimes on the front lines of these matters are less so. So by way of example, the SEC has a division, of economics and risk assessment that focuses on, among other things, using data analytics and machine learning to go through the various regulatory filings of investment advisors and pull out trends that help them to identify investment advisor misconduct. That's something that they use artificial intelligence technology to help their mission. They are able to do it, and I think it's been proven effective for their internal workings. It leads to issues of sort of false alarms that they then need to still run through, but it helps them to see issues that they would not otherwise be able to see by having armies of staff reviewing those regulatory filings, which just wouldn't be possible. And that's an illustration of how technology really can help their mission. And so while on the one hand you have rather sophisticated uses within an agency, on the other hand you might have a particular matter with a particular staff attorney where there is a dialogue between counsel and that staff attorney about how we're going to do email review or how we're going to get access to VPN records or some other kind of financial trading data in order to figure out what happened. And I think that as a general matter, the regulators are coming along in terms of their understanding of it. And as I said, some are quite sophisticated, but the sophistication is not always as prevalent when you're dealing with investigators. And then you have to have an interaction, have a dialogue, have a conversation with them about that, help them to see the tools that you can bring to bear on an investigation and how ultimately that will help what they're trying to achieve. And I think generally there's a lot of receptiveness to that.
Okay, that's great, and I think it's one matter to have an investigation at a regional level or within the U.S. I know, Wayne, that many investigations that you've dealt with are international in nature. They might be global in scope, and in that case, or they're specific to different regions where there are different sensitivities and different regulators. Wayne, what are you seeing in terms of the global perspective? What sort of sensitivities are required when you're outside of the U.S.?
The investigative approach inside the U.S. is different than outside the U.S. I'm not suggesting that it should be, and I'm not suggesting that it shouldn't change, but I am suggesting or stating that at the moment it is. In the U.S., we have a mindset. That mindset is all information is available to be investigated, and an organization, a typical U.S. company, will grab everything that they can and then say to the investigator, go at it. And then the investigator will apply either brute force or tools or a combination of the two. The rest of the world views information that is created by individuals differently. They protect the privacy rights of people to their communications. And they don't feel that the approach of reading everything that anybody ever wrote on their work email, including to their kids and their families and their friends, is appropriate. And as a consequence, outside the US, you deal with data privacy officers and you deal with the GDPR and other regulations. Asia is just very similar to Europe. The whole world is very similar, not like the US, and you got to start small. You have to take a look at what are the keywords that might be relevant to an investigation. What is the time period in a very finite sense? And you have to convince a data privacy person that the interest of the investigator transcends the interest of the individual as to a particular piece or type of data. So your investigative approach, instead of starting big and going small, is starting small and if you find things, going big. Where I find this to be problematic is with the advent of tools, because I don't think this was a problem before we had a tremendous amount of data and an investigative approach that used tools applied to it. Because starting that way results in your inability to get the gestalt, to play with the German concept, if you will. It doesn't enable you to get the result that you should, in the time that you should, or in the cost that you should. You get a partial result. And it also is potentially more invasive of an individual's liberties because keywords, rule of thumb, 20% relevance with the use of a keyword, which means for every 5 emails that you're reading, 4 of them don't relate to the matter whatsoever, and you have individuals who are now learning a lot about a person that they really have no business to learn about. Whereas, if you were to have a technological tool take a look at that pile of emails and reduce it down to a more rich environment where 75 or 80% is relevant, you're no longer impinging upon that individual's private communications to the extent that you would be otherwise. So I think it enhances the privacy interest of the individuals to use tools, and it improves the investigative result. And the issue for the group of us who get involved in global investigations is to be able to convince those who are involved in supervising those investigations to allow us to use a more advanced approach, not just because it's better for us, but because it's better for them too.
It's interesting to see a technology like Gmail even, where your mail is read by machines for advertising. And I think there's a growing acceptance of that trade-off in the personal domain. To me, it's very different having been read by a machine versus a human, and I know any day of the week which I would prefer. Brandon, I think a question over to you. If we are dealing with millions of data pieces all being collected, all from disparate sources, where are you seeing the biggest bang for our buck? Which part of the process, or is it standardized? Does it vary?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's. I think this is one issue that we come across where everyone thinks data analytics is one thing, and it's actually many different mechanisms that you can bring to many different problems. If I'm looking at trade blotter, I shouldn't be using a predictive coding engine in an e-discovery sense to find the relevant trades that I'm looking for. I should be using something that does pattern analysis on structured data, like financial records and phone records and that kind of stuff, right? So the use of different data analytics tools often is outside of the realm of what we would consider industry standard tools. And that represents a challenge that we run into sometimes where everyone's very comfortable with the e-discovery products that they've seen or the compliance products that they've seen and that they've worked with. But most of those still lend themselves to manual review of data. We're often having to reach outside of those general mechanisms, or that sort of general tool set, to draw in things that are going to help us sort of slice and dice data efficiently. And that obviously draws additional bias and additional skepticism. So I think when you're looking at bringing together millions of different data points, or actually probably trillions of data points in many of our cases, and making sense of them, it's not one size fits all, and it's sort of inappropriate to put a square peg in a round hole.
But if I could add on to that, I think what additional levels of complexity and challenge is that every company is different in terms of what they collect, what they have, whether it's results of legacy systems that haven't been fully integrated, right? Every investigation is different in terms of what you're trying to seek an answer to, and that may change over time. And so all of those factors go into what is the technology we're going to use on the data that's available in reflection of what the regulator's doing, what the individual locale's laws may be with respect to data privacy or other issues. And that's part of what makes this such a complex area, but also, frankly, what makes it so attractive as a way to get to answers more efficiently and more quickly, and to get to the meaning in the data.
I think that there are more than two, but there are 2 types of ways of looking at tools. One is the older set of tools, And those tools were intended to make what you were looking at when you handed it over for manual review to be more likely to be relevant. It was intended or designed to reduce quantity. We now have other types of tools that either measure potential relevance, detect patterns, place different pieces of information in relation to each other to derive meaning that did not otherwise exist before, unless you were fortuitous and had the same group of people reading the different sets of documents and saying in an aha moment, ah, I see this and I see that, and
Right.
that means something, which is a unique skill and is still a necessary part of what humans have to do for the most part. But they're better at it if they can have a machine learn a little bit about how they think and replicate a little bit of their thought processes to get them a little bit closer. And maybe you want to talk to that a bit, because I do think that this concept of tools is very poorly understood, and people just think of this as an entire box of hammers.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a waterfall that you often have to bring to this kind of analysis. I was just involved in a case where if we had taken the old approach and not said, okay, let's grab as much data as possible, even though that sounds very scary, and in a very small matter, we very quickly got up to 7.5 million documents. But in a recent matter, we said, let's grab as much data as we can so we can narrow the field of what we're going to look at. We wanted more variables to come through than less. And in this one investigation, one of the critical emails that we found was actually a conversation between a third-party help desk and our rogue trader that wasn't in his data set, right? It was a help desk conversation. And why would I ever think that one of my smoking gun emails was that help desk conversation? You know, if we had drawn lines and drawn a circumference around what was important to us, we wouldn't have found it. But what instead we said was, well, first let's begin with the trading data and look for information in the trading data that gets us to the points in time that we're interested in. And then let's be indiscriminate to who's talking at that point in time. So first we brought together a structured data tool that gave us visualizations of that trading data over time. And then we looked at everyone that could have potentially spoke or had a connection to that data at that point in time, as opposed to going the other way around. And I think, you know, looking back, I bet you I missed links in not to have anybody open up any prior investigations, but I bet you I missed links that I would have otherwise seen if I'd taken a different approach. I think this speaks to your point, Wayne. The presumptions and bias that we bring to even singular document review. If I've reviewed 1,000 documents and they were all somebody's fantasy football league emails, and then I get one document that's about any trade, it doesn't matter what trade it is, that document becomes the hottest and the most relevant document to me I've ever seen. Whereas somebody's reviewing trading records all day, they'd look at me and scoff for even bringing it to them, right? So I think you have to bring a diversity of tools, and I think B, you also have to bring an investigative mind to how you're going to use that tool set.
What you just said that was of particular significance is an analysis of structured data to assist you in taking a look at unstructured data, and the application of the expertise of the investigator to understand what is significant in the patterns that were seen in the structured data to analyze the unstructured data. Mm-hmm. And I bet you do that a little bit yourself.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, Wayne, I think that's a great point. Are there examples where you could highlight, hopefully not your own investigations, but that where we do see the bounds of technology, where it does have to be used in the right ways? Unstructured data often has very ambiguous meanings, for example, that by itself might not make sense to an investigator, but it's more a focusing matter that helps to focus on those examples.
we were looking at it in terms of going from the structured into the unstructured world. First of all, you can go the other way too. And then again, sometimes it's iterative. And sometimes it's multiple structured sources. It's really a question of the investigator understanding the data, the right tool for the data, and the right way to approach it. There is no secret sauce to this. There's a lot of skill that's associated with driving this.
Yeah, okay, great. Rich, do you have anything to add before we move on? Why aren't we seeing more rapid adoption?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Why aren't we seeing more rapid adoption? I think there are two factors that are probably slowing that down. And the first we've covered to a significant extent. I think the first is mindset. I think people, to a significant extent, still think of this as a document management challenge. Still think of it as, how do we put human eyes on 2 million documents, as opposed to, how do we find out what this giant corpus of data actually means? And so until that flip occurs, it's hard to really get in line with adoption. And then the second piece is really about business. And let's be honest, there are a lot of firms that have a business model that relies on having lots of people, mostly junior people, who are fed hundreds, if not thousands of hours doing things like document review. And a lot of firms have done very well with that. It's hard to let go when that is the model that has gotten you, so much success. But I do think that's a significant drag on adoption of tools like this, because they don't depend upon armies of people.
Yeah. Deming is famous for the comment that if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And you can certainly measure reduction in cost. You can measure the reduced amount of volume that you've looked at. But unlike the automotive industry, which can measure defects, it's hard to measure the improvement in the quality of an investigation. And so I think that part of the delay in adoption is the inability to drive a business case for it. You can successfully drive a cost business case, you can drive a speed business case. Difficult to show you're going to get a better result and what that better result is worth.
But and part of the complication, I think, exactly to Wayne's point, is that these matters come in every different flavor and every different substantive focus. And there are X factors, like if the CEO is saying, what's the answer to this? I need an answer by Monday, versus you have a regulator who's asking the question, but they're not particularly persistent, right? All of the matters have strategic elements to how you're interacting with regulators and interacting with the information gathering process and trying to divine meaning out of the mass of data. And so it's sort of, it's like the sort of three-dimensional chess games that you're approaching, how do I find this information out? You have all of these other factors. And I think it's some of those factors and the fact that many of the matters are non-standard that leads to a lag in adoption, and in the sense that we're still trying to figure out what's going on in the matters and the best way to approach it. And once you figure out the best way to approach something, there's some new issue. And that's frankly what keeps us all engaged and interested. So that's fun and that's good and employed, exactly. But it's partly just this the ever-changing face of fraud that you're trying to investigate that leads to some of that challenge.
And that's where I'm sorry. I think that's where the concept behind the equality argument is a strong one.
Yeah.
Because yes, every investigation is like snowflakes, right? Everyone is different. And so that's why experience means something. And so if you have a complex investigation, and if you had unlimited time and budget, you would have Wayne look through 7 million documents. But that's not feasible. That's not practical. So the previous model has been, well, you take Wayne and you break him up into 200 more junior people who are less expensive, and you let them have at it. The quality of doing that, the diminution in quality is obvious. But the way I look at analytics is you can take Wayne's Brain, which incidentally would be a great name for a movie, maybe a sequel to Wayne's World. And you take that intellectual property, you build a model, and you use the right tool to reverberate that across those millions of documents, and you get the better result. I think the concept is clear, but it's hard to measure.
And a lot of these large matters, as you said, are non-standard. And a lot of them are pretty phenomenal in terms of their occurrence, right? They're kind of black swan moments.
Yes.
And so I remember the first time I looked at 43 lawyers and I said, we're starting this case today and we are going to be looking for issues related to LIBOR. And I got deers in the headlights.
Right.
I mean, you know, I'm sure everyone was sitting there Googling
Right.
at that exact moment saying, what is this guy talking about? Am I in the wrong case? You know, but I mean, I think that to Wayne's point, the ability for experts in these areas to make nuanced decisions and to apply those nuanced decisions to a large corpus of data is much more resilient to scrutiny than having 500 lawyers sitting in a room playing a game of telephone, Googling what LIBOR is.
On the one hand, every investigation is a snowflake. On the other, I think one of the exciting trends that I'm seeing, and maybe Alex, you can talk to this a bit because of your expertise in white-collar crime, there's a tidal wave of judicial rulings. It started out purely around e-discovery. I think the days of e-discovery where lawyers could charge for reading every single email manually are hopefully over. But this is now extended with Rio Tinto, for example, the Rio Tinto case where it was extended into predictive coding.
Yep.
We are starting to see some level of acceptance at the legal level. Does this mean that there are areas that are safer? What are you seeing from your perspective when you're dealing with some of these matters?
Yeah, I think, as concepts like predictive coding become judicially recognized, it is harder to argue against that because there's been some, independent body who has weighed in and sort of acknowledged what I think we all as practitioners understand, and that's helpful. But it doesn't answer the question ultimately because it requires sort of collaboration and some transparency. And even in the Rio Tinto case, one of the sort of the guiding principles of Judge Peck there was that there was a dialogue between the two sides, and quite frankly, so they agreed on predictive coding. Quite frankly, that dialogue broke down, as it often does in civil litigation. Right, and and they've had, the judge had to appoint a special master, and it's gotten much more complicated. And I think that another dimension in the white-collar sort of crime arena and investigations is there are a lot of strategic concerns and considerations about how much transparency is appropriate, and whether there's a strategic advantage to being fully transparent with the regulator or not, or what can you explain to them and how. Sharing search terms, sharing the results of seed sets, sharing what other data sets you have found that they haven't asked about. Mm-hmm. All of those are complicated strategic considerations that are highly dependent on the particular matter and the particular investigative, regulatory body. Those bodies are increasingly sophisticated and are asking for more and more data so that they can do their own work, and you have a dialogue with them. But it is, I think, not the case that there's going to be sort of a judicial pronouncement that this is all, to be accepted and then we just move forward on it. And particularly in the investigative space where there's frankly a lot more nuance. I mean, quite frankly, the regulators typically just want to know the answer. They don't care quite as much about the particular technology you're using. They want to know, how quickly are you going to produce, the email of the 10 custodians that I've asked for? How quickly are you going to get me the trade analysis results that you've told me you're doing in your internal investigation, and you've agreed that you're going to turn over to me so I can conduct my, insider trading investigation or whatever it is that the regulator is after. So I think that what you see is a generalized adoption of technology to aid in investigations, because the regulators understand that means that we, the lawyers, can get answers to them faster, and speed is often of paramount concern. But it's not, it's not about a particular technology from the regulatory perspective, typically.
Okay. So if this is more results-driven, I do want to maybe drill down into one or two examples. Hopefully we can redact the names where possible.
Yes.
I know, Rich, that you recently led an investigation into corruption of elected officials for a state that we'll just leave there, out there. Yes. Were you able to bring analytics to bear in that case, and how was that helpful? And this is very much, I think, a snowflake, right?
Yeah, very, very much so. And that one I was involved in several years ago. And this is one of those cases which just would not have been possible without analytics, because the question that our team was asked to answer was, does money affect the behavior of elected officials? Spoiler alert, the answer is yes. But the way in which we were able to get to that answer was by taking disparate data sets, like lobbyist disclosures, outside income disclosures, legislative records, campaign contribution files. Some of these were in a form that was clearly not meant to be stitched together with any other data set. And to borrow Wayne's word from before, the gestalt was missing. And did I use that appropriately?
You did.
We have used,
Pronounce it too.
we have now used gestalt twice in this live stream. So we were able to bring all of these data sets, which were never intended to be looked at together, into one common platform, and they gave each other context. So a campaign contribution had meaning when you could follow the flow all the way through particular legislators to the disposition of a bill, whether it died in committee or whether it got passed. And so analytics made that investigation possible because it allowed us to see the whole, whereas we only had the parts before.
Great. Brendan, are you seeing similar trends when you're looking at anything from life sciences through to financial institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting when we look at the nature of structured and unstructured data, when we look at the varying data types. I mean, although 10, 15 years ago, we may not have had as much data to comb through, I think the quality of the evidence that has arisen out of this data-driven world has improved. I mean, today, I can triangulate when someone is leaving or going out of the office, when a trader is getting up from their desk to take a call off of the desk, right? I can even see in some instances those phone records if they've got a BYOD policy that allows me to tap into those phone calls and those phone records. So I think the way that I've seen data analytics improve what we're doing today is when you can peel back the wheat and you can find that chaff. I think it's much more valuable than it's ever been. I'm able to prove things in a sequence of HR data, CRM systems, even publicly available social media about where someone is and what someone is doing that has never been possible before, and I can make a much stronger case than I ever have been able to before. So I think at the same time that we're running into challenges and barriers with the size and the volume of data, I think in many instances the amount of behavioral science you can do around an individual target has improved dramatically.
I mean, look, it's a function of sort of the technological revolution in corporate America and globally, because there is so much more data. And so when you come to the question of investigating conduct at companies or institutions, it's how do you get at that data to find the answers and the meaning in the data. And because there is so much more data and it's in so many more different forms, it presents challenges, but it also presents those opportunities.
Yeah. Well, I would like to ask our audience and folks viewing on the live stream if they have any questions. We should have time for a few. If you want to go and submit them through the live chat, that would be great. In the meantime, I would like to ask each of you if you have any key takeaways before we enter into the Q&A session. Maybe Rich, we'll start over with you here.
Sure. So here's my one piece of advice for those of us who grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I'm not looking at anyone on our panel. There used to be a commercial for Sim's clothing store where the tagline was, "An educated consumer is our best customer." I think that piece of advice applies with equal power and relevance to consumers of complex investigations. If you are in the market for buying investigative services for complex investigations, you should ask how your provider intends to leverage the power of data analytics to make your investigation better and more efficient.
Great. Brandon?
So I'm a little younger than Rich, and so I'll use a G.I. Joe reference from the 70s and 80s.
I was going to say, that's not much better.
Now you know, and knowing is half the battle. I think knowing that data analytics comes in many forms is a first stepping stone to using data analytics efficiently in investigations. I think it's okay to take a certain thesis that you have or a hypothesis that you have and figure out what data is available and what tools you might be able to bring to bear to analyze that data. And don't let yourself get caught in the constant struggle to manage to compress timeframes. Because putting a bunch of lawyers into a room and having them spend 3 weeks doing document review is still 3 weeks that you're spending analyzing the data inefficiently. So if you took those 3 weeks and you measure twice and cut once using a more informed, better tool set, I think you're going to drive better results.
So I've got two takeaways because I'm a lawyer and get paid by the word. It's consider your aim and know who's on the other side of the table. So consider the aim is about thinking about what is our goal here. Is the goal to understand what's in the mindset of a particular group of employees? Is the goal to identify a pattern of suspicious activity, be it trading activity or coming and going, or digital coming and going, like VPN accesses or some sort of remote access to a network? What are you trying to get at? And the corollary to that, of course, is this something that has just blown up and is a $10 billion problem, and we're going to leave no stone unturned until we get to an answer of what happened? Or is this, the much more regular occurrence of, a whistleblower complaint or some sort of allegation that's lobbed in the media or by some advocacy group, and you're trying to figure out what happened, but you have to work within a budget and you have to provide value. And I think my view certainly is we always are providing value and being considerate of the budget, but there are some cases where clients do in fact say, find out the answer, don't leave any stone unturned. And those are different types of matters that allow you to access more types of data and do more with it. But as to the think about who's on the other side of the table, it's really important, particularly when dealing with a regulator, be it from the SEC, the Department of Justice, when the UK regulators, or any other global regulator, to understand what they know and think about these issues. And frankly, if they don't seem to be getting it, to suggest that they bring in some of their colleagues, because oftentimes the agencies have other staff who are very knowledgeable about this, and that can be effective at explaining what it is you're doing, particularly if what you're trying to do is explain how you're going to deliver results in more of a value way. Now, the regulators, the value being the money spent, is of less concern to them, typically, although not always. They're not immune to those kinds of arguments, but it's more about how quickly can they get answers. And if you can explain that and explain with credibility how it is you're approaching that, and if the person on the other side of the table is not getting it, politely suggest they bring in some other resource that will help them to understand how it is you're going to do better for them in terms of delivering those results of the internal investigation, that can be really helpful.
Okay, great. Wayne?
When Brandon was playing with those little figures, I was applying technology to legal problems. And I think we run a risk of sending the pendulum way to the wrong direction in thinking that, well, now we have artificial intelligence and we're going to take somebody's brain here and divide it into 200 pieces and throw it into machines and processors, and that's going to give us good solutions.
Yeah.
It's not. What we have here is a surge in the amount of data, both the types of data and the quantity of data. And that gives us an opportunity to get at something, ethereal, the truth, in a way that we never had before, if we approach it correctly. And with tools, we can take the salient pieces of information and get them out of this big mass of data. But there's really no substitute for the individual who can see the patterns that the machine can't. Because you can take and you can program a machine to think the way that you think, but that's not good enough. And you can program it to think the way a criminal might think, that also isn't good enough. You need to have something that's capable of allowing for creativity, and that we don't have yet in the machine. And whether we get there or not, it's not the foreseeable future. So there really is, my takeaway from this is you need to get a really high quality investigator who knows how to use all of the different tools that are available for them to use. And then you need to give them the freedom to be able to do it.
Great. Well, there are lots of great questions here. There's probably too many to answer. Maybe we can rapid fire a few of them. One of them actually piggybacks, Wayne, on your takeaway there. And the question is, can you talk about how technology can be trained to mimic the behavior of an experienced investigator? And let me just start with a statement as an example.
Well, I'll give a really good example. I don't have the exact web address, but you can use any search engine that you want to find it. It's something close to Chef IBM Watson. What IBM did with Watson, and it's publicly available, and it'll teach you how this type of intelligence works, is it took the Bon Appetit recipes for all of the issues of Bon Appetit, and it fed it into a database. And it then met with several of the world's top chefs, and it studied their combinations of different types of spicing and food and the like. And what it came up with was a rule set, an expert rule set. So we now have a database, pretty good database. People like those recipes. They're tested by humans. You have pretty good rules that I think are universally agreed. And then they apply it together so that you can type in what you have in your refrigerator and it will concoct something. Some of what it concocts is sublime. And some of it is, you're not even going to put it together. You know that it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And so, the point is, at the end of the day, artificial intelligence, as we stand now, is like that. It can give you some tremendous insights, but it's the person who has to decide whether it's worth cooking that dish or not.
Mm-hmm. If I can add one quick add-on to this, one of the fundamental things investigators look for is abnormalities, right? Things that are out of the ordinary. So much like putting together particular ingredients might be abnormal, so might a trader going to work at 2 a.m. on a Saturday might be abnormal. And that's what data is great at finding, is those abnormalities. And so that's a way that technology can, intuit an investigator's mind to highlight and bring up for further attention. Doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it, just like the recipe might actually work, but it's something that requires some additional scrutiny.
I guess I'll have you all over to my house for dinner for a new dish.
As long as it's not a peanut butter and jelly appetizer over pork.
No, and I think taking VDIQ as an example, it is great for open source intelligence sets, for helping with due diligence, filtering out a bunch of the mundane, so it allows you to focus in. But it's not going to give you that eureka moment by itself, right? And I think what we're seeing is a lot of that has to be paired with the right level of expertise, whether that's for internal data, external, or depending on the use case.
But to his point, anomaly detection is really wonderful.
Yep.
And that's something that is unique to the machinery.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
And it gives you that ability to have some early warning system to identify if there might be a problem and to start looking at it.
Yeah. Well, I want to just flip this around and maybe start back to the basics here. A lot of good questions on where do we start if you are an investigator and you want to brush up on your skill set, or you are a potential client and you're looking at different firms for figuring out where do you begin to incorporate these as either best practices? Where do you begin to learn about what is the state of the art, and how would you recommend doing that? And maybe Brandon, you can start with that.
So MIT is a great computer science program, and I think the best place to start is likely your providers, right? I mean, I think that often we put providers in the technology space into a box, and we don't often bounce the challenge off of them. Yeah. We ask them about functionality. And I think if we explore the challenge or the conceptual area that I'm trying to find, there might be more that a data provider, or a data expert, or a data scientist can tell you about what are potential avenues for analysis. The other thing is that I think from a starting point perspective, really understanding in your case what are binary decisions and what are nuanced decisions, right? So I have a lot of cases where there are truly discrete areas that are relevant to me that are not conceptually similar whatsoever. And I'll give you an example. The communications that a bond dealer is having with a trader at a fund are going to be completely different than the conversations that a compliance officer is having with a COO or a desk head. Right. And so looking at what the level of oversight is around a desk and looking at the misconduct are two very different things, right? And so I would also break my case into conceptual threads that I am trying to navigate or investigate, and then determine what types of data may be interesting, and then looking at who handles that type of data best. What types of tools are meant for that type of data, instead of saying, oh, I'm going to hire an e-discovery provider, or whatever else it is.
If Brandon's not going to say it, it's hire Exiger or get it done, right? To hire people who understands these issues. I mean, right, and it's, more broadly speaking, it's find people who understand the issues and are going to drive providing value to a particular situation, and to use technology in a way that is going to be beneficial and get you that meaning at a reduced cost.
You're asking a question, how do I get the knowledge? And I'm not going to quickly say, well, the answer is just go hire the person that already has it. Although that is probably a good answer for your problem that you have sitting on your desk today. I suggest you get involved in organizations like the Sedona Conference, where I've been involved for all 15 years. where you can actually meet with and talk to people who are on the cutting edge, where you see many of the providers who have services there not actively pitching you as to what to purchase, but actually talking about the problems that we're all sharing and what the potential solutions might be. And the vendors are there, and the law firms are there, and the corporations are there. And that's not the only setting.
Yeah.
You know, the American Bar Association has some. You just have to be careful where you go to make sure that you're not going to a place that is a solid is a pitch. You want to actually see what people in the trenches are talking about. And you're not going to learn it in a day, but you do begin to get that knowledge yourself.
Great. Great. Well, I wish we had time for more questions and more war stories as well, but we've run out of time for today's live stream. I want to thank you all for attending and for your insights. I also want to let you know that there will be a chance to ask questions via email, and we have another live stream planned for the fall around third-party risk management, and you can sign up for that shortly at www.exiger.com. Again, thank you very much for being here today.